Today we're going to be learning Rosh Hashanah Daf Kaf Aleph. This is the Daf for Shabbat. We're going to start at the very top, Levi Ikla LeBavel. Okay, we're going to have a few interesting stories today, a lot having to do with the exile and people who didn't live in Israel and didn't necessarily hear about what the days were. So we learned yesterday that we were talking about this topic, and we said that you always choose like the day you think it's going to be and then the next day, and not the previous day. So we now have a story that Levi arrives in Bavel b'Chad b'Tishrei, on the 11th of Tishrei, the day after Yom Kippur. Amal, basim tavshila de Bavlai b'Yom Rabba de Ma'arava. Look at what great tavshilim the Babylonians have on a day that's the holiday, the big day of Israel. In other words, he gets there on Yom Kippur, and they have to on the 11th, which he claims is Yom Kippur in Israel. And he says, I don't know what's going on here. It's Yom Kippur in Israel. How are you eating and how are you having these nice big meals? So first of all, you have a bit of a question, maybe a very basic question, which is how did he arrive there? If it was Yom Kippur, according to him, how is he traveling on Yom Kippur? That's an aside. I'll leave that aside. Some commentaries comment. You can look at some footnotes. But the real question is, what are we supposed to do now? Imagine somebody shows up. Now, Yom Kippur is the one day we don't keep 2 days. Although we'll see, maybe some people did. But what are you supposed to do when someone comes and says, oh, by the way, you messed up the date. You're supposed to be fasting now. So what's their reaction? Amrele Asi. They said, okay, so testify. You got to testify in court. You can't just make statements like this. Maybe you're lying. Who knows? So Amar Lahu, he says to them, Lo shamati mi pi beiti mikudash. I didn't hear it directly from the court, but they sanctified it. I know that they did, but I can't testify about it because I didn't hear it directly from them. We're going to see this later in the daf, that they made a rabbinic decree that even if you know it's Rosh Chodesh, because you know for all sorts of reasons, but you know it's Rosh Chodesh, we'll get to this later, on Tishrei and Nisan, when it affects what the dates of the holidays are, you can't say it unless you actually have real testimony from the court that they actually sanctified it. Knowing that it's the case is not sufficient. So very strange. What's going on here? So first of all, if that's all a rabbinic decree that you can't testify unless you heard it, but what about the fact that it's still right that today's really, he does know it really is the 10th, and they're all eating. How could you do that? It's almost one of those cases of what's the rabbi say overrides the Torah almost. So one opinion is to say, yes, it does. It overrides. It's just what it is. Overrides the Torah. The next option is to say, well, when the rabbis instituted this takana, part of the reason they instituted it was in case the Babylonians had already done it, then you can only testify. And once it's done, then we leave it. Now, once it's done, you can't testify unless you really know for sure. But if you don't know for sure, then not. And this was already done. They already celebrated Yom Kippur based on what they thought was the truth. It's almost like that's enough. And therefore, since they have already done it, he can't testify. But had he shown up before, he could have testified. Had he shown up before Yom Kippur, he could have testified even without hearing it directly from the court, and the Babylonians would have followed. That's a second option. Third option relates to the fact that, number one, we normally say you need 2 witnesses. How could he possibly testify as one witness? So one witness is believed for certain things, and it really would be believed for this. The problem is that normally, now what happened? What happened was Elul had 30 days instead of 29. But almost always Elul has 29 days. And since there's this concept, we've actually learned this before, since there's this assumption that Elul almost always has 29 days, that's what we call Rov. That has significance. It's saying normal years, we go by the majority. If we don't know, we go by the majority. So we have one witness who doesn't have direct testimony versus the Rov, the majority, which is most years, Elul is 29 days. Therefore, this isn't going to work. And we're not going to accept his testimony. So even on a Torah level. So those are all ways to understand how this rabbinic decree could basically make people end up not doing Yom Kippur on the day that really, in terms of the absolute world, it is Yom Kippur. It shows again the whole concept of determining the date. And here it's fascinating because they did determine that was the date, but they just didn't know. And the Babylonians ended up doing something different, and it creates this complicated situation. Next. Macher is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan made the following announcement. That means not only is he saying this is the halacha, but he's saying I want everyone to keep this halacha. If the shlichim in Nisan came, but if you live in a place Where Nisan, they have enough time to get there before Pesach. But in Tishrei, they don't. Why not? Because you have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. You have a day of Yom Kippur. We all know what it's like when you have all the Chagim, especially this year when it wasn't on Shabbat, any of them. You have so many days that you can't actually travel. So because of that, your Shlichim of Tishrei might not get to the same distance, right? They clearly won't get the same distance that they'll get in Nisan. So if you live in a place like that, where in Nisan, the witnesses get there, but in Tishrei, they don't, even when they come in Nisan, they tell you exactly what day Pesach is supposed to be. La'avdu trei yomi. You still need to keep 2 days of Yom Tov. Gzeira Nisan atu Tishrei, because we don't want you to think that in Tishrei you only have to keep 1 day for Sukkot, and therefore we insist, but also in Nisan. That's what Rabbi Yochanan came to say. By the way, this seems to indicate that it wasn't clear those in Israel, those outside of Israel, but right, it was just a matter of where the witnesses got to. And there's big debate among the commentaries. The Rambam and who is it? Right, the Rambam says it's all based on if the messengers got there or not. So if we talk about nowadays that we're going to keep the custom of our fathers, what they did then we would basically say, right, I'm just translating literally, minhag avotenu biyadenu. Then it would be based on where we live. Did we live in a place where the witnesses got to or didn't get to? So it could be you have a place outside of Israel where the witnesses got to, and therefore you wouldn't need to keep 2 days nowadays. But the Ritva says, no. We draw the line at Chutz La'aretz, Israel and outside of Israel. That's the bottom line. We don't start doing it by where they got to, where they did it. By the way, the Rambam, people say, according to the Rambam, could be that witnesses didn't get to a certain place in Israel because nobody lived there maybe, and witnesses never went there. And then theoretically, you'd have to keep 2 days because you wouldn't have known had you were living there. It's a little tricky to say that because they could have reached you, but maybe you could come up with a place in Israel that was far, it was really far from the center and you wouldn't be able to, and then it would be an issue. Okay, now, Rabbi Yochanan said this. Now we have a story. Rabbi Aivu bar Nagav, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, iklu lahu atra. They got to a place. Davamatu shluchei Nisan v'lomatu shluchei Tishrei. Shluchim of Nisan got there, but the shluchim of Tishrei didn't. So, la'avdu trei yoma, gzer, I missed it, ve'lo amre lehu ve'lo midi. They only did 1 day for Sukkot, for Pesach, and they did 2 days for Sukkot. So, they didn't say anything, these two rabbis. Shamar Rabbi Yochanan v'ikpid. Rabbi Yochanan got very upset. These were students of his. He said, Amar lehu, Lav Amare lehu, didn't I not tell you? Exactly this case, where the Nisan messengers get there, but the Tishrei ones don't. We make a gzera. You can't do it in Tishrei and Nisan either, because you might then come to think Tishrei is only 1 day. So we got very upset with them that they didn't tell the people that they were doing something wrong. Next, Rava, you're going to be very surprised by this. Be prepared. Rava haba ragil davayativ v'ta'anita trei yomi. He would fast 2 days. We assume he's talking about Yom Kippur, although there are some commentaries that say he really means Tisha B'Av and not Yom Kippur, and that no one would think on Yom Kippur because it's like doing 2 days of Shabbat in a row, which they never make you do. That's why our calendar never falls out next to Shabbat, not just because you couldn't not eat 2 days because Shabbat you eat, but the fasting is one element, but keeping Shabbat like that for 2 days, because even on Yom Tov you can cook, here you can't. So anyway, for various reasons, some people claim it's talking about Tisha B'Av, but others think it's actually talking about Yom Kippur. The simple reading seems to be Yom Kippur. And Zim Nachade Eshkach Kapate. One time it turned out he was right. In other words, it wasn't really the first day, which is usually the assumption, but it actually was the second day, and it was good that he did this. So the Gemara seems to actually be saying that maybe it's a good thing to keep 2 days of Yom Kippur. Again, assuming you're talking about Yom Kippur. Now, many of the commentaries go against this, and Shami, it brings up the issue of sakana. It's dangerous to fast for 2 days. It's not a good thing. It's not looked very fondly upon. And in fact, we're going to see another story now, another interesting story. Rav Nachman, Yativ B'Tanita Kule Yom Kippur. Fasted Yom Kippur. That's pretty basic. Everybody does that. Le'orta atahu gavra. A guy shows up toward the evening before the fast ended. He says, by the way, tomorrow is Yom Kippur in Israel. So that means that basically you think Yom Kippur is almost over. Guess what? It's only starting now. So Amarle, Nachman is obviously a little bit not very happy to hear this. Could you imagine you're sitting at the end of Yom Kippur and someone tells you, by the way, right, you've been counting the hours and figuring out, okay, I'm almost there. And then someone tells you, guess what? You've got a whole day going forward. So Amar le mehechat, he says, where are you from? Don't know why he asked that. Amar le midamharia, from the place called Damharia. Amar le dam tehea charito. He does a play on words. Rav Nachman says blood will be his end, which basically is he's talking about himself. Most of the commentaries say, I'm going to die. It's like a way of saying, right? You know, sometimes you feel that you're like, I'm going to die. Okay, this guy is basically bringing me a message of death to me. Kare ale, and then he said about him, Kalim hayurod fenu, the people who run after us are very fast. What was he talking about? Well, if he'd come a little slower, I would have eaten, and I would have been at least get a little bit of energy to make it another whole day. Chaval that he came right now, and it's a very interesting reaction because you think he's happy that he wasn't mechalel Yom Kippurim by eating. But instead, his reaction is, oh, well, it would have been permitted to me had I thought that Yom Kippur ended, right? So here again, it shows that if you're outside of Israel, and when it comes to Yom Kippur, where you're not keeping 2 days out of Suffolk, you can assume this is your day, the day that you think is the day. Especially we had the Rove to go by that most years Elul is Chaser. It's only 29 days, which means basically we can know when Yom Kippur is supposed to be. And if we made a mistake, we made a mistake. It was a legitimate mistake. You know, it wasn't our fault. We're okay. So he really would have wished that he had eaten and then been able to have the energy to go forward. Shalach le Rav Huna bar Avin le Rav. So Rav Huna bar Avin says to Rava, Kadchazi demashcha tkufa tevet ad shitzar b'nisan abra laut shata v'lo techushla. This is a very complicated thing. I'll try to explain it simply. If you see that tkufa tevet, that the equinox, okay, which is the beginning of spring, okay, the end of the winter, beginning of spring, the equinox lasts until the 16th of Nisan. Okay, there's a whole debate. Do we mean up to and not including the 16th, or up to and including? There's a big debate when we talk about the equinox. Do we mean that the equinox is the last day of winter or the first day of spring? So there's a whole different way of counting these dates. But he says if you get to the 16th, Abra Laishata, make a whole new extra month. In other words, if the equinox is on the 16th or up until the 16th, and the winter lasts, make that year a leap year. You have to add a whole nother month. Why? Dichtiv shamor et chodesh ha'aviv. Okay, lo techushla means don't worry that there's another opinion about this. So there's a whole debate in Sanhedrin. We'll get there and learn it more in depth when we get there. But according to Acherim, you need if the first 14 days can be in the winter, but that's it. Okay, beyond 14 days, or again, it's a little tricky where you put the cutoff. Is it from day 14? It has to already be spring. Otherwise, you don't have the majority of the days being in the spring. And then you don't have Shamor et Chodesh Aviv. Shamor Aviv shel Tkufa she'eh b'Chodesh Nisan. You need the Aviv, the majority of Nisan, to be spring. So now how does it work? If the 16th is, let's say, the beginning of spring. So if it's the beginning of spring, then what happens? The 15th, right, is not, okay? And then you don't have your extra days. You could always do what, though? What you really need is for spring to start on day number 14. In order to make that happen, if the equinox is on the 16th, there's no way to fix that because you're 2 days behind. So you can only add a whole month. If it's the 15th, then again, it all depends on how you count. And you could say this otherwise. You could say the 16th really means the 15th, and then it really means the 14th. Again, let's not get nitpicky about that. But the idea is that if it's only 1 day difference, you can fix it by what? Normally, Adar is Chaser, 29 days. So you can add one more day. That will push everything off a day, and then you'll be good. Because your day number 14 will be in the spring already, will be the beginning of spring or maybe the last day of winter. But the point is that will work. But if you have 2 days off, which is until the 16th, then you're going to have a problem. And then you're going to need to do a whole month because 1 day is not going to help you. Now we have a problem. We're on the sea. If you're on the sea, so you don't have messengers coming to you. So what do? So Rav Nachman says to the people on the sea, he says, listen, you guys don't know the Kfiyah Diarcha. You don't know when the Rosh Chodesh is. So you're going to have to use nature to figure it out. Sorry, I skipped. So Burn your chametz when? You need to burn it on the 14th. Burn it when you see the moon setting at dawn, okay? When it starts to set at daybreak, see the moon setting at daybreak, you know that that's the 14th, and then you know that that's the day you have to burn your chametz. So now the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Ema mashlin. When is that normally seen? B'chamesh on the 15th. At that point, it's too late. Ha anamer ba'asar mavina. You have to burn it from the 14th. So they say, L'didu dimagalalu alma me'arba samashlim. The view of the people who are on the sea is different than the view of the people on land. They see the whole horizon and they actually see it setting at daybreak. And this is very interesting because they see it on the 14th, what we see on the 15th. It's interesting, your perspective. It's almost like there's a reality, an absolute reality, but your viewpoint is different from depending on where you are and what you can see. New Mishnah. We're going to have two more Mishnayot of the daf. Al shnei chodashim mechalalim et haShabbat. For 2 months, you can desecrate Shabbat in order to testify. If you see the new moon, you're allowed to desecrate Shabbat to get this whole debate. Do we mean even deoraita, melachot mideoraita, or do we mean only things that are rabbinic in nature, like Tchum Shabbat, passing from city to city, right? Obviously, if you're coming from far, you're going to pass the Tchum Shabbat, or maybe something else that you have to do. It's only rabbinic. So there's debate among the commentaries. But only for 2 months do we allow you to do this. We'll understand this a bit later. Al Nisan va'al Tishrei. Only on Nisan and Tishrei. Now, it only allows you, we're only allowed to desecrate the Shabbat to come to say, I saw the new moon. We don't allow this if it's for messengers going to other places. No, it's only for those people coming to say the new moon. So why is that? Because in Nisan and Tishrei, shebahem shluchim yotzin l'Surya, because then we send out messengers abroad. Now, we're going to have a bit of a question. We send out messengers abroad for 6 months. But the point is that for Nisan and Tishrei, you need it for the holidays. And based on that, they determine the holidays. Therefore, it's very important. And those are the ones where we determine the 3 regalim, because Pesach and Sukkot are in Tishrei and Nisan. And Shavuot is determined not based on the moon. Shavuot is based on whatever date you made Pesach, because it's 7 weeks later, exactly to the date. So it doesn't matter what we determine with the new moon or not. When the temple was still around, we allow you to sacrifice. We allow you to desecrate Shabbat because of the sacrifices, because you need to know if it's Rosh Chodesh that day and whether you need to bring sacrifices in the temple. So for that reason, we'll also allow you to desecrate Shabbat. So the Gemara starts off and says, more, we can't. What about the Mishnah? Or Minu? We saw this Mishnah before. There's 6 months the messengers go out. You said for the 2 months the messengers go out. So Amar Abai Hachi Kamar. This is what he meant to say in the Mishnah. Al Kulan Shluchim Yotzim Ba'erev. Al Nisan Val Tishrei Ad Shishmeu Mipi Beit Mekudash. Okay, this you would think this was an easy answer. It's quite complicated to understand. So this goes back to what we saw in the beginning of the daf, which is on Nisan and Tishrei. They said we're not going to let you go to tell people unless you saw the Beit Din sanctified. On other months, you can go even ba'erev. Now, they never did Kiddush HaChodesh at night. But let's say you see the new moon and you know clearly it's the new moon. You don't have to wait for the Beit Din, okay? Or let's say they didn't do day number 30. Then it's obviously going to do day 31. You don't have to wait till the 31st day in the morning. They sanctify the Chodesh because you know already, so you can go out. But you can't do that for Nisan and Tishrei. Why not? Because now in the 31st day month, you definitely won't have this. But because of the 30th day month, they don't allow it at all, which is you're sure that they're going to make it a new moon. But maybe they'll decide for whatever reason, the Beit Din will decide there's some other issue at stake. We're not making it. So since that affects the day of holidays and people doing work on the holidays, right? If you think it's the wrong day, you're going to do work. And that's a problem from Torah law. It's very serious. So we're not going to let you go to be a messenger unless you heard the Beit Din sanctified. Now, if we don't allow witnesses to come and desecrate Shabbat, what will happen? Nisan and Tishrei will always be determined on Sunday morning, not on Shabbat. Now, you might determine that yesterday was, because the Eidim will come and say, Friday night I saw this, and then they'll determine on Sunday morning that Rosh Chodesh was actually yesterday. And then what will happen? Normally, the witnesses, and this is what we saw before, Al Kulan Shluchim Yotzim Ba'erev. On all other days, if it happened on Shabbat and the witnesses didn't come, but they know for sure which day, because at this point, let's say Shabbat was day number 30 and Sunday was day number 31, and they know which day is going to be Rosh Chodesh. So the witnesses can go out, but they can't do that on Nisan and Tishrei. So because of that, they're going to lose time, because if you could have determined it on Shabbat, they could have left Motzei Shabbat. And now they're losing time now. Some of the places, it might take almost 2 weeks to get there. And then people won't know about the holiday. So because of that, they said, on Nisan and Tishrei, we'll let you be Mechalel Shabbat, desecrate Shabbat, so that the witnesses could get moving earlier. Otherwise, they'll have to lose like half a day. They're nighttime traveling and the morning till the Beit Din actually sanctifies. Tanya Nami Hafi, right to support, Al Kulan Yotzimi Ba'erev, which was the basis of this whole thing. You can leave at night, even if you didn't hear them sanctify it, but Al Nisan Val Tishrei, Ad Shishmeu Mipi Beit Din Mekudash. Until you hear the Beit Din say it, you can't. Tanu Rabbanan, another bright. How do you know that for the holidays we're allowed to desecrate Shabbat? Talmud Lamar, it says in the pasuk, Eile Moadei Hashem asher tikruo otam b'moadam. This is in Parshat Emor, when it talks about in Vayikra all the holidays. It says these are the Moadim that you will call them in their right time. So therefore, we're allowed to do it even if it's Shabbat. Yachol kashem shemechalalim ad sheyitkadshu, kach mechalalim ad sheyitkanu. You might have thought not only then, it's so important to designate the holidays, maybe not only to determine that it's a new moon, but also to go announce it to people. That's the Mikayim Achit Kaimu, so people will know. Talmud Lomar, Asher Tikruotam, call them. Al Kriyatam Atamachalel, V'iyatamachalel Akiyumam. You could only desecrate Shabbat for the calling of the month, not for the passing on the message that we call this month, Rosh Chodesh. Okay, we call this day Rosh Chodesh. It's only for the Kriyah, not for the passing on the message, getting the word out. Now we're going to deal with that last line, that when the Beit HaMikdash was around, they did it even for Rosh Chodesh. At what point did they stop? You would have thought as soon as the temple is destroyed. But we're going to see, interestingly enough, not exactly. Tanu Rabbanan, if you remember, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is living in the period right after the destruction, and he institutes all sorts of changes because there was no longer a temple, like Yom HaNef Kulo Asur, the day after bringing the Omer, right? That whole day we're going to forbid eating the new crop. Then we had the Lulav you take for 7 days, Zecher LeMikdash, right? These things were Zecher LeMikdash, other things. Anyway, now we say, Barishona Yom HaChalalim Afa Kulam. So in the beginning, they would be mechalel even on all the day, all the months. V'shacharav Beit HaMikdash. Amar lehem Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. It sounds like when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says to them, "V'chiyesh korban." Sounds like they wanted to desecrate Shabbat, and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "What are you doing? Why are you desecrating Shabbat? There's no korban anymore. Right? Like, get with the program. There's a change, right? You have to make a switch in your head. We're no longer in the temple, right? You're used to doing things, but sometimes there's no reason to do them anymore." So then it's kinu shelo yu mechalalim ela al Nisan val Tishrei bilvad, and then they basically got rid of all the Rosh Chodesh ones, and then they said only Nisan and Tishrei. New Mishnah with an interesting story. Ben shenireh ba'alil, ben shelo nireh ba'alil mechalalim alav et haShabbat. Whether you see it clearly or whether you don't see it clearly, you can desecrate Shabbat. You might have thought, only if I don't see it so clearly, because if I see it clearly, imagine you're sitting on Friday night, you see the new moon, you think, okay, I'm living in Haifa. The Beit HaMikdash is pretty far. I'm sure there's people who are living in Jerusalem who saw this. It's so clear. There's no clouds. It's a clear night. You can see the new moon, no problem. So you don't go. Comes Tanakh and says, no, you can go. However, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Im nireh ba'alil, em mechalalim alav et haShabbat. He thinks you don't go because I'm sure someone else will do it. Right? Again, if you're living in Jerusalem, you don't need to desecrate Shabbat to get to the temple. There was a case where there were at least 40 people going on the path to Jerusalem, 40 pairs of witnesses. Rabbi Akiva stops them in load and says, listen, there's enough people going, right? Stop here. Shalach lo Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel heard about this and he sends a message to him and he says, what are you doing? If you prevent these people from coming, they're never going to come back again next time. If you stop them, next time they'll be sitting in their house in Haifa and say, well, last time I got stopped in Lod. What was the point? Right? You have to make these witnesses feel good. Otherwise, you're going to mess up our whole system and people are going to stop coming. So it's kind of like the doctor is going home from the hospital on Shabbat. If you don't allow them to go home, they're not going to come next time. So we need them to come, these witnesses. So therefore, we're not going to change it. Right? We're going to let them come, even though we have way too many witnesses. It's a very interesting, right, viewpoint, but very relevant. Gemara starts off, my mashma dahai aliyah lishana de megali. First, it talks about etymology of the word. How do you get from aliyah to clarity? Where do you see that? Amar Rabbi Avahu Amalka, the pasuk says, Imrot Hashem amarot tahorot. The words of God are clear, pure words. Kesef tzaruf ba'aliyah la'aretz. They're silver that's refined, that's clear in the land. Okay, so aliyah there means clear. Mizukak shivatayim. It's refined 7 times. Now they're going to darsh in the end of this verse. It's clear 7 times. They're going to teach, this is talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, that he had 7 times the amount of knowledge. We'll see in a minute what this means. Rav Shmuel, Chanamal, 50 sha'arei bina nevu'u ba'olam. There were 50 gates of intelligence in the world. V'kulan nitnu leMoshe chaser echad. And they were all given to Moshe minus 1. So there's assumption there were 7 gates of chokhmah, of intelligence, of knowledge, or understanding is really what Pina is. And it says Shivatayim, so it's about Moshe. Moshe had 7 times that. 7 times 7 is 49. From there, he gets to the 49 Sharei Chokhmah. And then, Shenemar, how do we know this? Because it says, Batach Sareu Ma'at Me'Elohim. He knew a little bit less than Elohim. So there's this one Sharei Chokhmah, Sharei Bina that he didn't have. Bikesh Kohelet, so Divrei Chefetz. Now, it says in Kohelet, that Kohelet, which is a reference most people think to Shlomo HaMelech, wanted to have divrei chefetz, things of delight. And then it says at the end of that pasuk, v'chatuv yosher divrei emet. That's the verse. Kohelet wanted divrei chefetz, and it says, how would you translate it? It says katuv yosher, things that are straight, divrei emet, words of truth. So they're going to understand this as a foil. He wanted something, but truth hit him in the face. So what's that truth? Bikesh Kohelet liyot keMoshe. He wanted to be like Moshe Rabbeinu and be as intelligent, right? We always talk about Shlomo HaMelech with his chokhmah, and Kohelet especially, right? It's all about chokhmah. Yetzda bat kol v'amra lo. Heavenly voice came down and said, "V'chatuv yosher divrei emet." But words of truth are going to prevent you. Why? What does it say in the Torah? V'lokam navi o b'Yisrael keMoshe. There was no other prophet like Moshe, so you won't attain the level that he attained, and that fits in with this. Moshe had 49 levels of Bina, and right, that was it. He only left 1 for everybody else. But the other one said, it was Rav Shmuel, they both had this machloket. So the other one says, no, he was able to achieve the intelligence, the Bina, the intelligence that Moshe had, the understanding, because it says, Lo kam o b'Yisrael navi keMoshe, only a prophet, but you could be a king like Moshe. So he had the knowledge like Moshe, the Bina, the understanding. Ela. So then, according to this explanation, Mani Makayim Bikesh Kohelet Limtzo Divrei Chefetz. What do I do with that verse? Bikesh Kohelet Ladun Dinim Shebalev Shelo Be'edim V'Shelo B'Hatra'ah. He wanted to judge people based on what his heart told him, and not with witnesses, not with Hatra'ah. He said, "I'm so smart, I can just figure out, I can intuit who's right and who's wrong." But Yatzta bat kol v'amra lo v'chatuv yosher divrei emet al pi shnayim edim yakum davar. No, the Torah says 2 witnesses. You can't do it without witnesses. It's very interesting because it connects to what we were learning about. Can you tell people that it's the new moon just because you know that it is, or you see it's obvious it's the new moon? Do you need to go testify that? How important witnesses are, that you might understand and everything else, but until there's witnesses, court doesn't convene. Court doesn't decide. They need to work on witnesses. We can't go by people's intuition, just get us into trouble. With that nice, interesting thought, we will end the daf, and we will start tomorrow with the story about Rabban Gamliel that we saw in the Mishnah about stopping the witnesses from coming or not stopping them, etc. Have a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov.